Car is available. Good afternoon, ma.
Good afternoon.
Yeah,
How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. So we're waiting for every other persons to come.
Okay.
Well done, ma.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Congratulations on
Thank
your
you.
book.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Yes, so I will be waiting for them. So I will
Yes.
switch off my camera now, but I'm here.
Okay, no problem. That's
fine. Whenever when it's time to start, I'll switch it on.
Okay, that's fine.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
Okay. I'm the host here. Here I am. Thank you. So is everyone checked in?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, ma.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Let me
Good afternoon.
find our page.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon.
Hello.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
And this is Professor. There's an echo.
That's all that I muted mine.
Oh, okay. So they need to mute, is that it?
Just me because it was picking up the mic.
Oh, okay. So I'm Professor Eronki Oyewumi, and I'm chairing this panel titled Engaging Feminist African Philosophy, Women and the Politics of Difference. That's a book by Abosede, Ipadeola, Routledge, 2022. Welcome to the panel. Do we have everybody here, including Olayinka? Is this a sign that she's here?
Olayinka is here.
Olayinka is here, but she's just not showing her
Yes.
face. Well,
Okay, I will in the moment.
well, it's your prerogative, but it's always,
So,
as Yorubas will say, Ojuloro wa. Discourse is in the face. So we like to see the face. But you know, it's your prerogative.
yes, it is.
Yes, so I'm not putting any pressure. Oftentimes, I join people without showing my face either. Anyway, so welcome to the panel. And as I said in my email.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
Yes, as I said in my email, we're going to follow the order in the book that's in the program. And I am going to, at least initially, I think, I would allocate 10 minutes each for the panelists. Okay? And then at some point, we know that the author will respond, but that would be close to the end. So let's start with the 10 minutes. And then I'm doing that because I'm hoping if we have more time, people can come a second time after thinking of one question or the other, okay? So without further ado, it's 12:48, and I would like to call on Ope Akoliowo of Dominican University to start us off. So Ope, please.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So my name is, just like Professor Oyewumi has said, I'm Ope Akoleowo, formerly of the Dominican University, Ibadan, but now of the University of Ibadan. And I want to start by first extending my appreciation to the organizers of this conference for this opportunity. I would also like to say to Dr. Ipadeola, congratulations on this remarkable feat. We're proud of you over here. To the book proper. Feminist African Philosophy, Women and the Politics of Difference. A book published by Routledge under its Routledge Studies in African Philosophy series. I see the book as a timely and insightful, as well as thought-provoking exploration of gender concerns in African philosophy. What the book does is it provides an exploration of the intersection between African and feminist philosophies, And if you look at these two areas, both of them started as reactionary and resistance studies. The former, African philosophy, started as a reaction to Euro-American epistemic hegemony, and the latter started as a reaction to patriarchy. And so for me, I see it as a much needed resource, not only for feminist scholars, but also for all philosophers and scholars in African studies. More importantly, I see it as an important resource in utilizing African philosophy as a means to heal the pathologies occasioned by the colonial project. And, you know, the book tries to argue that this is a task that will be effectively carried out where African philosophy itself is inclusive as opposed to its current androcentric nature. And so in that light, the book is an important addition to feminist scholarship with its recognition of the historical marginalization of women's agency in knowledge production, especially in philosophy, a field where men are traditionally taken as, you know, both the subject and the object of study. The book's main thesis is that African philosophy as it is does not represent the thoughts of all Africans. And so to ensure that there's this inclusive presentation, African philosophy must inculcate and mainstream gender issues and feminist perspectives in and across its study. And to drive home this point, Ipadeola divides the book into two parts comprising of a total of 8 chapters, in which she delves into diverse philosophical theories while exposing her readers to an analysis of the implications of these theories on the lives of African women and the development of the African continent in total. And I look at it, I'll start by presenting a chapter-by-chapter summary of this work. I hope I'll be able to do that in good enough time. Chapter 1 begins with an analysis of philosophy vis-a-vis the exposition of the varying attempts at answering the questions, does African philosophy exist? If it exists, what is it? How is it done? What is its scope? What are its goals? And in this chapter, Ipadeola exposes the reader to the varying approaches to defining African philosophy, including the historical perspective that is characterized by an intense debate over when the discipline began, as well as definitions bordering on the scope and content of African philosophy, where she delineates African philosophy into its branches, and she defines it in line with the concerns raised in these branches. In chapter 2, she examines the various strands of African feminisms as posited under differing nomenclature. This chapter revolves around whether or not Western feminist issues related to patriarchy, subjugation, and marginalization are of concern to African scholars, and how these issues are approached where they are regarded as a matter of concern. And in doing this, she exposes the thoughts of feminist scholars like our own Professor Ironke Oriewumi of Ife Amadiume and Nkiru Nzeogwu, who hold that gender is un-African and is best understood as a colonial legacy, as well as those of scholars like Bakare Yusuf who argue otherwise. She sides with the latter's citation of cultural practices that provide evidence of gender disparity, to provide evidence that Africans indeed do gender, as well as to show contemporary practices that showcase the dynamics of culture, to show that gender inequality is an undeniable fact of contemporary African realities. She concludes this chapter with the assertion that gender egalitarianism is a necessary condition for Africa's development. In chapter 3, she discusses the androcentric nature of African philosophy, beginning with a highlight of the critique of Western feminist philosophy's hegemonic stance on feminist issues. And here in this chapter, Ipadeola makes a distinction between the fundamental underpinnings of women's oppression in Western and in African societies. For her, she says in Western societies is predicated on reason, and African societies is predicated on the gender of power. In chapter 4, she introduces the feminist African philosophical approach as a panacea to gender inequality. She defines this approach as a theory that is based on the equal treatment of all persons, whose goal is the mainstreaming of issues relating to women in African philosophy. And in this chapter, she emphasizes that by acknowledging the diversity of experiences among African women, feminist thought becomes more inclusive, more empowering, and relevant for all African women, regardless of their individual circumstances. As such, the book can be characterized as one that is centered on not just a call for inclusivity, but also on the recognition that African women's experiences are multifaceted and heterogeneous. In chapter 5, she discusses the epistemic tyranny against African women in epistemology. And here, she emphasizes how epistemology as a theory of knowledge oppresses women, echoing in that sense Kelly Winter's and Rupert Hillman's question: whose truth is heard and validated? Whose perspectives are trusted and
Okay.
Okay. And so in chapter 6, she talks about women's marginalization in relation to moral standards in Africa. In chapter 7, she looks at the realm of African metaphysics and presents the reader with metaphysical justifications of women's marginalized societal status. And so my first concern is the omission of the thoughts of professional African women philosophers, if I might call them that. For example, late Professor Sophie Oluwole, who is very well renowned for her groundbreaking work in African philosophy. It seems that, by this omission, she sends the message, while African philosophical thoughts can be distilled from the thoughts of scholars in various disciplines, there's no evidence to support the reality of African female philosophers who are trained in that discipline. Then is our emphasis on gender equality. And I come to this point in light of criticisms that are made against, the notion of gender equality, that it is in itself unnatural and it will lead to gender inequity. And I ask, is gender equality itself a possible goal? Is it a desirable goal or end in itself, or should it be understood as an initial rung on the ladder to gender justice? And then I look at a assertion she makes on page 76, where she states, and I quote, traditionally, many African cultures wedge strict distinctions between the domestic and the political spheres. I find this claim particularly problematic in the sense that she herself contradicts this by the discussions she has in the second part of the work. For example, where she recognizes that the Victorian ideology is responsible for the dichotomy between public and private sphere participation for women in contemporary African societies. So if she argues herself that this was not the case, why then would she make an assertion that traditional African cultures evidenced strict distinctions between the domestic and political spheres? And, just for one time, I look at her exposition on African metaphysical issues relating to women. And I find this discourse restrictive. First, in the sense that it is mainly restricted to Nigerian cultures, and then in the sense that it is also mainly restricted to cosmogonical but not cosmological accounts. And in that light, I would suggest that Ipadeola reads Babatunde Lawal's Ejiwakpo, because Ejiwakpo provides a cosmological justification for the Yoruba culture's belief in oppositional complementarity, a belief in a binary fusion of opposites to achieve equilibrium, where reality is portrayed as composed of two oppositional but complementary principles.
Your
and
time
there are
up.
other examples also.
Please wrap up.
Okay, I think
Yes.
overall, I
You
see that
you can come to some of those things later.
Yes, I would bring in these points later on if there's more time.
Yes.
But overall, I just see that the book itself offers a unique perspective into what it means to be both an African woman and a philosopher today. And its strength lies in how it allows its readers to engage with a diverse range of perspectives, how it draws out the complexities and nuances of feminist African philosophy, and how it challenges the one-dimensional and often homogeneous representations of African women and feminists. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Okpe. Thank you. And the next person we would like to hear from is Sharon Omotosho. It's exactly 1 o'clock. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Prof. I will want to switch off my video so that I can run within the 10 minutes. And I want to thank Dr. Ipadeola for giving us something to chew. This has been a wonderful one. I have taken time to read through, and I find that it's a very enlightening effort that you have put together. The book Feminist African Philosophy, Women and the Politics of Difference. The entire exercise is focused on decolonizing African feminism within the field of African philosophy. And what she intended with the book is address the exclusion, defamation, degradation, and dehumanization of African women occasioned by the maleness of philosophy. The book is organized with an introductory section, 8 additional chapters, and a concluding section. It's a careful compendium of well-researched literature providing comprehensive analysis of precedents to general readers and beginners, and at the same time, a set of critical reflection for established scholars. The compact size of the book makes it suitable companion to take to places where it can be read both for leisure and possibly research engagements may require. Ipadeola's ability to read deeper meanings into texts affirm her depth as a philosopher. She questions unattended gaps left by ethno-philosophers, philosophical sages, nationalist ideological philosophers, and professional philosophers. She traces this to the idea of man of reason, gender of power, heroes, fathers, which underlaid Western philosophy has spilled over into African philosophy by virtue of colonialism. Indeed, she attempts to fill in the gaps and write women into African philosophy. This she ventured by discussing selected concepts and ideologies, calling out eminent philosophers for their omission or commission. She responds to identified gaps by offering the missing link, which she describes as feminist African philosophy. She alludes that feminist philosophers are saddled with 3 main tasks. First, to look for the biases against women in the cardinal branches of philosophy. Second, to draw on philosophical concepts and theories to articulate different feminist claims and political positions. Third, is to find a home for some issues and concepts in philosophy. And by her third claim, she's describing feminism as alienated from philosophy, an observation that has been made by earlier scholars, although not so pronounced in African philosophy. By spotlighting how both women and men experience same disaster, but different societal demands, the debate on whether Africa does gender or not continues among scholars. However, Ipadeola's kernel of the discourse to mandate feminist philosophers who are also African philosophers to take on the task of revealing where feminist philosophy failed to address African women's challenges and where African philosophy equally failed to take the same into cognizance. I'm fascinated by a section of chapter 1 where Chemakunam's conversational philosophical method was discussed, who described that as petty considerations here. The statement is unclear and would have been further clarified. I consider as belated the statement in chapter 2 that African feminists are at a crossroad of either aligning their narratives and ideas with their sisters in other parts of the world or define their unique kind of feminism, showing what is African, because African feminism itself is a decisive effort to settleize from Western feminism. So anyone who identifies as an African feminist has traversed that crossroad. In chapter 3, Ipadeola tries to illuminate something about the schools of thought and their androcentrism, extending to chapter 4, where mainstreaming gender issues in African philosophy is discussed. There was a long stretch of about 6 pages discussing decolonization before its definition was ventured in that chapter. The next part of the chapter then presented the kernel of the book, sadly, in a paltry 2-page analysis. Although the following chapters were written with an intention to situate East African philosophy, which I call for short, FAP, in each issue discussed, I did not particularly enjoy the presentations. I imagine that readers would be seeking the theoretical foundations of FAP in more comprehensive presentations, rather than its infusion into existing bodies of work. This strategy worked in earlier chapters, but more should have been done from chapter 5 to the end of the book to simplify and clarify the concepts and idea of FAP, its nature, its forms, the challenges and prospects of using it. With authors' assertion that FAP does what African philosophy does, and by extension encourages African philosophers to perform their task in gender-sensitive manners, I think the theory seeks better definitions, better clarifications, and in fact, its own identity. What does FAP include or not? Or what does FAP include and or exclude? Who may use FAP in their theorizing? What should FAP be doing differently from existing bodies of feminist theorizing? The answers sought to these questions will determine how FAP would be engaged, either as a feminist theoretical framework or as a feminist methodological tool. Fundamental to decolonization is the capacity and tenacity to name and to shame. Ipadeola's efforts with postulating FAP is commendable. I dare say that she has displayed the required courage for decolonization, name the concept and bringing it to limelight. On this note, FAP should not be discussed in future tense, as she did on page 105, when she said it hopes to correct the deep-seated gender disparity. FAP seemed to capture previous works of African feminist philosophers, which perhaps author is also unaware of. That is why it is troubling that author asserts that no attention has been paid to the art of mothering as essential to the realization of decolonization in contemporary Africa. She said that on page 100. For instance, concepts like femocracy, extractivism, symbiotic interactionism, Stewanism, humanism, detrimental agency, feminized corruption, among others, are evidences that FAP has been in existence without due attention paid to naming. In essence, one is also curious about the status that FAP would assume in relation to previous works on African feminism. How do we teach FAP? That's another question. And is it only to be discussed within the confines of African philosophy? I will wait for answers to this. Overall, the book is well researched. Although a few cited texts were missing, author displays consistent enthusiasm to jump into the women discourse throughout the book. However, a consciousness of the need to provide philosophical basis for every argument complicates each chapter. Author's background in philosophy explains why she complicates the issues with details, making it difficult for general readers to grasp the subject at an initial glance. Although our finesse for detail provided sufficient scholarly information for beginners who might not have known the origins of the conversations, I imagine that author would have focused on decolonizing feminism, discussing various strands of feminism, and leading on to why feminism is maligned by unwary African philosophers. I therefore recommend a book, first to feminist African philosophers, then to students of African feminism, for the purpose of more rigorous analysis to expound the subject of feminist African philosophy and to provide it with the deserved identity, both within African philosophy and feminist philosophical studies. Thank you.
Okay, so that's
You're muted, Prof.
Thank you. Right on time because it was recorded. I love that. And going off screen, what's that whole business with the door? Yeah, but do we have to sort it now?
No.
Okay, I'm happy to hear that. Okay, so thank you for that presentation, Sharon Omotosho. Let us now go to the next person, and who is Olayinka Oyeleye, two of University of Ibadan. So Olayinka, it's your turn.
Thank you very much, ma'am. And I want to thank the earlier presenters as well and the organizers of this conference. I want to commend the author for this long-awaited groundbreaking work. Long-awaited because while we have bodies of work that we can affirmatively categorize as belonging to the discipline of African feminist philosophy, I have yet come across a book which is specifically of the subject matter. So I would, on that note, raise a toast to African feminist philosophy, not just African feminist scholarship or African feminist theorizing, but to African feminist philosophy and to African feminist philosophers. The book, Feminist African Philosophy, Women and the Politics of Difference, is a critical engagement with the discipline of African philosophy from the perspective of an African feminist. So like the earlier speakers rightly said, it is engaging African philosophy on the one hand and African feminism on the other. The first part of the book, which consists of 4 chapters, lays an essential groundwork for the discourse, with chapter 1 exploring the historicity of African philosophy, its conceptual dilemma, and core tenets. The discussion in this chapter is devoted to the period of the commencement and subsequent establishment of the discipline of African philosophy. The author's reiteration of these discussions, quite peculiar to most reviews on the discourse on African philosophy, appears to have neglected what one might perhaps refer to as the progressive philosophizing of Africans, or simply the progress of African philosophy in more contemporary times. I could literally hear the voice of Chris Huro, and those of us that were in UI together during that period when we had Chris Huro, you would be able to relate with this. I could relate to my undergraduate days and my first contact with African philosophy, and I found myself asking, what has happened to African philosophy since the days of philosophical sagacity and Dogotomeli and ethnophilosophy? What have we done with African philosophy as professional philosophers? And to echo the voice of Adesina Afolayan, the discipline of African philosophy is an extremely vibrant field that has expanded beyond its modest early beginnings. So hence, despite its engaging arguments, I'm on chapter 1 now, I would have thought that the chapter could have paid more attention or be more attentive to contemporary questions, including recent trends in African philosophy, especially in the face and age of globalization. The second chapter traces the trajectory of feminist scholarship in Africa and correctly upholds the notion that decolonization is fundamental to any significant agitation for equality by and for African women. The chapter attempts primarily an analysis of the dominant narratives, and this is where I have a huge problem. Okay, so it analyzes the dominant narratives and claims of African feminists, such as Ifiamadiome, Nkiru Zeugu, Ronke Oyewumi. The analysis, however, centers largely on these 3 Nigerian, and I'm having that in bold and in caps. Okay, these 3 Nigerian feminists creating and recreating otherness through our scholarship. I mean, that's, in my opinion, we need to consider that we are not creating and recreating otherness through our scholarships as feminists. The one thing we are fighting is dominance as feminists. We are fighting dominance either in one tradition or gender dominance or centricism, Eurocentrism and all the rest. But we keep recreating this even in our work as feminists. There's that constant recreation of categories of authority. We keep having one and the other. And I want to make a quick reference to an experience I had while I attended the Gender Institute, Kodesria, in Senegal. And Awino Okech she was facilitating the session, and she had asked us to write the names of 10 African feminists that we had read. And from number 1 to 7, I had Oyewumi, Oyerunke, I had Amadiome, I had Nzeogu, I had Amina Mama, I had Ogundipe Leslie, and Ipadeola. It was only 7, 8, 9, about 3 others that included the names of other feminists outside of my geographical location. And what am I trying to say? The other Francophone Africans had not read Anglophone Africans, African feminists. Same thing with us. So there seems to be this, problem with our geographical location. I don't know if it appears to be political to me that we end up, it's so, the proximity, it's about those that are within our geographical location that we read and we talk about. So much as I agree that Oyewumi's invention of women has, for example, become canonical, and it's almost like a Bible, for us African feminists, I still believe that we can read these texts with fresh insights and shine our intellectual and critical touch on dark crevices, thereby revealing fresh untrodden paths. I believe that much as it's become these works have become dominant. For example, the critique by Bibi Bakari. Bibi Bakari is seen as the major critique of Oyewumi. There are other people who have done this. If we keep, I don't want to use the word regurgitating, but I mean, for want of a better word, if we keep doing this, it's like we are then recreating that dominance that, it's just about this circle of people. What's happening to those on the periphery? How do we then include their voices? Which is what I believe as African feminists, we have fought over the years. Black feminism, feminism in America, all the different trends that they have and how we are felt excluded. But within scholarship, even as African feminists, we keep still recreating these. Quickly to get to the last 2 chapters in the first part of the book, titled African Philosophy and the Shackles of Androcentrism and Mainstreaming Gender Issues in African Philosophy, a decolonizing effort. We have the
Hello,
third chapter.
I said you have 3 minutes.
Oh, okay. Good.
Yes.
I should be able to make Okay, so
we'll come back to some of these issues, but you have 10 minutes in the first instance. You have 3 minutes.
So I will just go to the second part of the book quickly. It examines the core areas of philosophy and its variants in African philosophy vis-a-vis women's marginalization. Chapter 5 discusses epistemology, how it has hideously underprivileged women, and specifically how certain forms of knowledge, for example, proverbs, have been a form of epistemic tyranny on African women. With chapter 6, it looks at morality in relation to the African women. It selects feminine issues like virginity, adultery, widowhood rights, amongst others, to critical scrutiny, reiterating fundamental questions which underlies feminist ethical concerns, especially in the African context, and which is the question of the relativity of moral standards between the sexes. And to just say quickly, I was surprised that some theorists who had worked on this were omitted from that work and very close to the author, right? They're next door neighbors to the author. Chapter 7 considers issues from a metaphysical perspective in both traditional and contemporary Africa. Metaphysical themes such as gendering the supreme being, the implications of reincarnation, and the limitations of ancestor worship on women, as well as witchcraft, were explored. And I would like to see probably in subsequent books where these topics are picked on and, really, really expanded upon, or maybe you have chapter contributions by other authors on especially the metaphysical and the ethical aspects of it. So the last chapter, titled Women, Marginalization and African Political Theories, discusses the subjugation of women. But aside from a quick mention of Orokpotonius sex reassignment, we really didn't have much contemporary like the LGBTQ community, being discussed. So in conclusion, I would say the book concludes by addressing the imperative of bridging the gap between theory as episteme and praxis as doxa or popular opinion. Ipadeola admonishes that an appraisal of the philosophy of the continent through the lens of gender is essential and crucial in moving the continent forward, because philosophy is the bedrock of ideas called episteme, upon which ideas called doxa, which shapes people's behavior and practices are built. The book is definitely an invaluable contribution to the field of feminist philosophy and feminist scholarship in Africa. And like I earlier mentioned, it is groundbreaking work, particularly because it signals a commencement of an African feminist philosophy. So well done. Thank you.
Thank you. You've kept to time. We appreciate that. The last person among the panelists, we'll have a lot of discussion time, it seems, is Stacy Vanderhurst from the University of Kansas. Stacy, it's your turn.
Can you mute your, then I'll mute that way.
Yes.
The mic. All right. Good afternoon. Okay, can the participants hear me? Ipadeola, can you give us, thank you. Okay. I'm so grateful to be here this afternoon, and I'm so grateful for all of the wonderful outlines that have already been presented, breaking down this book for us today. I was humbled to be invited to participate in this panel as primarily not as a philosopher. I'm a women's studies scholar with a background in anthropology. And I think my exposure to feminist African philosophy is typical of the very issues that are outlined so clearly in this book, that there are pieces of African philosophy that have been adopted into a women's studies canon in the US, but this kind of sense of a broader contribution really needs to be made. And this book makes such strides in outlining both the lack, the consequences of not having African feminist philosophy as recognized, as developed, and also the potential for what can happen in these fields, in these overlapping fields of feminist studies, African studies, and philosophy as we move forward with the kinds of issues raised in this text. So I really value the way it brings together emphasis on decolonialism, on feminism, and on indigeneity. And as a non-philosopher reading this book, I was especially grateful for the very accessible and clear writing, presenting such thorough background in the opening chapters and throughout, to really orient a reader like myself who doesn't necessarily share some of the same common texts that might be shared in this room today. I was also really surprised at how interdisciplinary the text ultimately seemed, that it not only gave such a welcome tour of work that's been done in African philosophy and African feminism, but also itself in the kind of analysis and evidence it introduced was using historical examples, sociological explanations of exclusion, anthropological accounts of gender difference, of cultural norms, folklorist stories from different cultures as evidence of different ways of thinking, and ultimately as philosophy itself. So it was a really kind of wide-ranging engagement to cull out these essential contributions of feminist African philosophical thought. From all of that, I really took away more of a command to move forward than an outline of particular contributions just yet of what feminist African philosophy can give us. That the politics of difference really emphasize, I think, in a critical way, why we need to be investing in these kinds of issues rather than the results themselves. So we have examples of what can happen, but I saw more in the text almost a polemical claim about how women have been excluded from this field, excluded from recognition on the whole, and what kinds of issues just haven't yet been addressed. So in raising these questions, for example, about sexual violence or about inequality, about gender norms and culture, we've identified the problems of inequality in these spaces, but we haven't yet then seen all of the solutions. And I think that the kind of path forward that's left for us in this text is quite a radical one. I was really, I'll say, surprised and provoked by some of the claims that knowledge itself shouldn't be recognized as knowledge if it's not liberatory. And I think that's a provocative position, and I'm eager maybe to talk more about what that means within epistemology itself. There's so many examples of knowledge within science that is used to harm. You know, the atomic bomb is, I think, a classic example of a kind of understanding that does lead to harm and destruction. And I think it is interesting to say that not only is that knowledge harmful, but that kind of knowledge shouldn't be recognized as knowledge at all if it bears those kinds of consequences on society. I think you could easily find examples within this text of social science knowledge being used in the same way. As an anthropologist, I'm deeply familiar with the colonialist history of my own field and the way that social science knowledge of how different communities were organized, about how power was functioned, was used to manipulate, colonize, and subjugate those communities. To call that knowledge not just harmful, but not worthy of the name of knowledge itself, I think is quite radical and has me thinking deeply about what that means for the process of decolonialism within academia more broadly. There's so many other questions that have already been raised that I want to keep my remarks brief so that we can continue to bounce things back and forth off each other. I did want to raise two particular questions as we move forward into conversation. First, I was quite interested in the way the text consistently defines gender difference as fundamentally unequal, which to my mind challenges a great history of debate within feminism, including within African feminism, about the role of complementarity that I think has been mentioned here today, but wasn't really as thoroughly addressed, I think, in this text, that you can have difference without subjugation or difference without hierarchy. And I would be interested to know more about that position, to take what I think is a more radical observation, that anytime we're seeing gender difference, different expectations for these two groups, that it's necessarily hierarchical, or push back on that interpretation of the text as I read it, please. The second question I have is about moving from what are some rich examples, I think has been mentioned, from the Yoruba context, Nigerian context, to what I found to be less consistent examples from other parts of the continent. The book makes a very important, august claim to be charting a course for feminist African philosophy writ large. But as an anthropologist, I found more particular explanations that went deeper into particular folkloric traditions, or even the Yoruba adages that were used in some of the later chapters, those had a richness that weren't necessarily present in depictions of other communities or cultures as examples of ethical norms or gender difference. And so I would like to hear more, if we have time, about the choice to move from what were some very specific claims about Yoruba and some other Nigerian cultures. Igbo culture is represented better in some areas, to claims about the whole continent. Anthropologists are very comfortable with very particular, narrow claims, and I think the goal here is to build something much broader. But there wasn't, to my mind, an explicit balance, for example, on different corners of the continent. And so I think that's an interesting theoretical move that shows maybe the how different disciplines approach the kind of generalizability of their claims, or the universality of some of these positions. So I would love to hear more about how you thought about that as a philosopher, as you were reviewing these kinds of the kind of evidence that you listed. So finally, thank you for taking on such an immense task. Thank you for offering such a accessible and valuable tour for someone that's a little more outside these circles. And thank you for including me in this conversation.
Thank you, Stacy. You didn't even use all of your time. We have a lot of time left. I'm not muted, I hope. We have a lot of time left, and I think that it's a good opportunity for us to do a back and forth. And if you would allow me, I'm the chair of the panel. However, the subject matter is very close to what I do, and I want to make some observations. In fact, some of them taken off from Stacy. She said a couple of things that I want to put on the table, and I want the panelists who have asked a few questions already to sort of hone their question, and we will direct it to Abosede, so that she'll respond to some of them, and maybe we'll go back to her and we do a back and forth. That was my hope in sort of piecing out the time in that way. Two things I want to say off the bat, and I hope the panelists too will think about this and speak to the issue. I have heard Abosede Ipadeola present before. I have seen her do a lecture. So some of my knowledge is also coming from that presentation. But two things that struck me off the bat is Ipadeola, and I'm also seeing that in many of the panelists, the way in which it seems as if Ipadeola just accepted the terms of discourse on the table. There's no questioning one way or the other about the fact that there's a discipline called philosophy. There's no questioning of the idea of disciplines in the first instance. This is a time of people talk about interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, and if we look at the history of disciplines, more recently, new disciplines developed, like women's studies, like Black studies. So the very idea of disciplines is on the table and should be on the table. And so I would like Abosede to speak to that. That's one thing. Another thing that I think is important here, and Stacy started to allude to it, is the unit of analysis. How can Africa be a unit of analysis on these questions? How is Africa a unit of analysis? So those are two general questions I want to raise. And at the risk of being the author that is not too happy with the critic, I will say this. I'm surprised that Oyewumi, Nzegu, and Amadiwe are grouped together as if we entered a room and wrote about the same thing. It's not true that Amadume doesn't subscribe to gender. And I'm saying this, and it's important, on behalf of Ife Amadume, she was the one who introduced the concept of gender fluidity to the global discourse, especially now that we are talking of LGBTQ, trans this, trans that. It's a big issue. And oftentimes I said, people are not given Ife Amadume her due. So for you to claim that, oh, she doesn't believe in gender, it's just not true. And those things are really important. So the desire to group these three Nigerians together, I don't know where the desire comes from, you know, but I think you need to consider it. And then when you one of the things I hear people say, oh, Oyewumi doesn't believe in gender, that there's no gender in African society. That's not true either. I wonder what they're reading. Because the whole point, and I keep saying, is to historicize. And what invention does is to historicize. How did we get to now? And the now that invention historicizes is a gender-saturated now. And I don't begin to even get that sense in what Abosede Ipadeola presents in the book. I won't talk any further. I think that we should give her some time to respond to some of the issues that people have raised, and then people can come back, panelists can respond, and then she'll have more time to respond to the responses. Or does anybody have a better suggestion? For now, let's hear from the author. Thank you. Abosede, it's your turn.
Yes, ma'am. So thank you so very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Before I address the numerous points that have been raised about and against feminist African philosophy, women and the politics of difference, I would like to express my deep appreciation to every member of this panel. Thank you so much. Yes, I sincerely thank every panelist for your invaluable comments, your insightful critique of my work. You have offered very fascinating perspectives on the ideas that I've discussed in the book. And I promise to take into account all of these points while revising the book for the second edition. I promise. Thank you very much. Also, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference, particularly Professor Aderito, for making this event possible and for providing this platform to examine works on Africa and its people, with a focus on honing and controlling our narratives and our discourses in a way that tells the world that Africa is rising. We are rising and we will never take the back seat again. This gives me some sort of hope and optimism that with every conversation, every engaging conversation that we have at this conference, the future of our continent shines brighter and brighter, and this gives me so much joy. And this is where the aim of writing feminist African philosophy, women and the politics of difference aligns with the spirit of this conference. I was motivated to write feminist African philosophy by my observation that if Africa is to rise from its past and move forward to the kind of future that it will be possible for Africans, both on the continent and even in the diaspora, to be proud of their racial identity. It is imperative for us as Africans to hone our narratives because many anthropologists, like panelists have mentioned, and like I have in the book, like many philosophers, renowned philosophers, anthropologists, ethnologists have written so many things about Africa, and especially during the periods of slavery and colonization. And many people believe that all of that is in the past, that we have moved beyond that level. Well, to an extent, this is true, especially if one resides on the continent. If one resides in Africa, where most people are of the same racial origin, this is true, because nobody is going to discriminate against you because of your skin color. Nobody is going to come against you because of some other prejudice that is rooted in your racial identity or your gender, or your racial identity in particular. However, when one goes out there, suddenly one begins to see Hegel, one begins to see Blumenbach, one begins to see all these scholars who have written, one begins to see them all around at restaurants, airports, everywhere. So that is why it is important for us to rewrite our history, to rewrite, to hone our narratives, to hone our discourses, to rewrite all these narratives that have been written against us. And that is my focus. That was my goal when I set out to write this book. So to counter wrong ideas and concepts, in my opinion, is to offer alternative ideas and counter narratives. And that was what I wanted to do with this book. And like you have all said, maybe I've done that to an extent, or maybe I still have much to do. But it's still, even though the book has been published, what gives me joy is that I can always revise the book and make it better, putting all these ideas, all these comments into consideration. And at the same time, I'm also writing some other papers, some other works. That's what it means to be a scholar, to be an African scholar, or any scholar wherever one finds oneself. So I will put all of this into consideration. So I believe that every voice matters to move Africa forward, such that a continent that is so blessed with abundant human and natural resources will not just continue to depend on external financial and intellectual aid. I believe that every voice matters. Women's voices also matter greatly. So this is that's my position. So I'll go on now to look at some of the comments that have been passed. And I would like to say at this point that in case I omit any of the points that we have made, I've really taken note of the points. In case I do not address any comments, it is because I've noted it and I'm going to work with it. So, but I will respond to most of our concerns. And if I omit any point, it is not because it is illegitimate or it is invalid. It is not because it is irrelevant or it is not important, but because I will work with it later. So, Dr. Akpalewo, thank you very much. You mentioned that I omitted some of the thoughts of Professor Sophie Oluwole and other female African philosophers. Well, as a matter of fact, like I stated in the book, I argued in the book that it is not that women's voices are not heard at all in African philosophy. It is not that they are non-existent in the African philosophical space, but their presence is not prominent. And this speaks to gender equity, this speaks to gender equality as well. So the fact that I didn't discuss Professor Oluwole is something to note for me. I understand that Professor Sophie Oluwole is a prominent voice. The voice continues even though she's not with us any longer, but our voice is still with us, and our voice is a prominent one. And I talked about, I believe I talked about, I discussed the idea under witchcraft, where I discussed witchcraft because, or maybe I think I read our work on witchcraft, and I believe I included it. So I'll take a look at that again. But this is a valid point. I will look at it again. Then you asked whether gender equality is a possible goal or whether it is an end in itself. Well, I have stated that the goal is for Africa to be able to rise beyond its current level. And maybe I would also briefly talk about what Professor Oyewumi mentioned, that how did we get here? By and large, what I've talked about in the book is that, yes, I do not dispute the fact that to a very large extent, our traditional African societies recognize the place of women. And women, especially in some parts of Africa, women were allowed to do certain things, not allowed in the sense of being permitted, like this where you must get to, this where you must not get to. Women were free. They were free. But at the same time, how we got here, which is strongly tied to our colonial experience, is what we must evaluate and re-examine from time to time. I agree that that is what we must do. And this is likely what I have also done. That even if we trace our history back and we realize that, although I do not agree totally that there was nothing like gender discrimination in traditional African societies, but my point is that it was not so bad like what we have currently because of our colonial experience. So because of our colonial experience and everything added together, bringing us to this point, it is very important for us to interrogate all these points, all these positions, all these ideas. And this is what I've tried to do. This is what I've done, looking at all these issues that we have picked along the way, and which are also tied to our past in a way. Some of them are also from our past, even before our contacts with the West. So this is what I've tried to do. So whether gender equality is possible or whether it is an end in itself, I would say it is not an end in itself, but it is a means to an end. And the end is that Africa needs everyone in order for Africa to rise. Africa needs everyone, and any idea, any position, any practice, cultural practice that undermines gender equality, that does not allow women to come forward to actualize their potential, cannot move Africa forward. So that is my position. Then you also asked whether metaphysical representation of women is that metaphysical representation of women is basically about Nigeria and also about oppositional complementarity. Well, I would say, looking at all the points that I made, especially the issues that I mentioned in the book, about cosmogony, about craft and other metaphysical issues, I explained that all these issues, they contribute, maybe not explicitly, but in a way. If one reads all these issues, taking the issue of witchcraft as an example, if there's a predominant belief that women are witches, they are evil, all these contribute to how women are viewed and treated. And that is the point. that I do not want us to overlook. So no attention, then I move on to no attention has been paid to decolonizing the discourse. I believe there is a whole chapter on decolonization in the book. There is a chapter on decolonization. I recognize the importance of decolonization. I know that I am of the view, I'm of the view that decolonization is imperative, it's important. And there is a chapter on it. I dedicated to looking at how to go about decolonizing our discourse, our feminist discourse and other African and Africanist discourses. So I agree that decolonizing is important, it is fundamental, and I looked at that. Then how do we teach feminist African philosophy? Definitely, feminist African philosophy is still ongoing. I think starting off is very important. And this is what this book, I believe this book has been able to do. We started by looking at those issues that contribute to the marginalization of women. I believe that is where to start to teach feminist African philosophy. Looking at,
okay,
and also
Abosede, am I muted? Hi, I'm just thinking you've covered some things, which is wonderful, but I think we should break this at this point and ask the panelists if they have pointed specific questions that they want you to respond to, and then you can go on again. So please, panelists, is there something you particularly want her to speak to that she hasn't done yet? Okay. Olayinka, Sharon, and Stacy? Okay, yes, please, Sharon.
Yes, I want to say thank you to you again, Abosede. But I read the book in putting myself into three positions. First, as a student. So I was reading like, let's imagine I don't know anything about all of these. And here is this book placed before me, and I need to read it and get familiar with some of the issues. I found it quite interesting. You gave me, I didn't need to go into the library to pick each of those books, even though now we know that there are some bits of, you know, I don't want to call it misrepresentation or misinterpretation of text, you know, and things like that, which are not even your fault, but which has been carried over, you know, from different spaces. Then I read as a student, I appreciated that. I then started reading like a teacher. And because I teach philosophies of feminism, and because I also am a feminist philosopher, I wanted to find out, what is it that Ipadeola is bringing to the table that I have not done, that I have not read, that I have not written, that I have not seen around. And when I looked critically, I was looking for a chapter, you know, that says something about, that chapter is purely for feminist African philosophy. I was looking for that. And then when Akoliwu raised the issue about feminist African philosophers, or African, how did she put it? She said
African women philosophers.
Yes, African women philosophers in the professional area. I saw that's also a big gap. There could have been a chapter that talked about these women. So it gives us a background that this thing has existed, it has just been undermined. And then I was now looking as a teacher to see, how do I teach feminist African philosophy? Is it a methodological framework? Is it a theoretical framework? And I was looking for, what are the forms? What are the, so I didn't need to see how you used it in witchcraft and the examples and all of that. So I'm still waiting for you to give me an answer. What do you call feminist African philosophy? Is it a theory? Is it just a concept? Is it a method? I need to know so that when I enter class and I need to put this on my curriculum, I know what exactly I'm doing and how to use it. I'll pause there and then we can continue.
Okay, thank you. Should we take more from panelists, I think, so that then you come back? Yes. Who else wants to add to their interrogations of Ipadeola? Stacy, any more questions?
Olayinka has one.
Oh, okay. Yes, I see Olayinka's hand is up. Yes, please, go ahead.
It's not really a question. I think I want to respond to what Sharon just asked. I know that what I think Ipadeola is trying to do, I'm not trying to speak for her anyway, but to just quickly chip this in. She stated that she's foreseeing a theory that in which all persons will be viewed and treated as equals, regardless of gender, race, or social status. And I think I quite understand what led to that. Let's even forget the fact that as feminists, we're all about equality, but it's a different thing where you read theoretically. It's a different thing what you experience on the continent as a woman. What you experience as an everyday Nigerian woman or Yoruba lady is totally different from what you experience when you're outside of the continent. Okay, and so I can relate with that experience in the workplace, that experience on the road, in restaurants and wherever, so I understand that fight, that drive, that need for equality. I also think something new that book has done, which, to be sincere, we might pick up bits and pieces of it in various work or chapter contributions or whatever. But for me to have it come together,
We lost that?
Frozen for me too.
It's frozen.
under one body in one book. She has looked at philosophy and then African philosophy. Okay, and I mean, should I still continue?
Yes.
Okay, so she has looked at all of these tenets of philosophy, and she has tried, to look at it from the feminist not just the feminist perspective, because of course in the West you would have feminist ethics, you would have feminist metaphysics. But once these issues cross over to Africa, they become a different problem. Some of those things do not pertain to us as Africans. So she has looked at it from an African feminist perspective. So, I mean, like I said, I'll just try and speak for her. Thank you.
Okay. So should we? Yes.
Olayinka respond to that. Okay.
Okay. Please do.
Yes, I would like to respond to Dr. Omotosho. That what exactly is it? Is it a theory or a concept? Or I believe it's a branch of African philosophy. And this also takes me back to the initial question, whether disciplinary boundaries are still relevant, whether they are still needed in these contemporary times. Yeah, they are not needed, but at the same time, each discipline, it is still imperative, in my opinion, for each scholar to know what the conditions are in each discipline. For example, there are certain features that distinguish philosophy, that makes philosophy to be different from, say, psychology or politics or political science or some other disciplines. while a scholar is conversant, familiar with all these features, with all these qualities, it is equally important not to allow those boundaries to limit what a scholar is able to do. And to an extent, like Dr. Van der Oost has pointed out, in the book, I looked at the works of different scholars from different disciplines, psychologists, sociologists, different political scientists. And so while it is important for a scholar to know that these boundaries are there, but it is also important not to be limited by those boundaries. Then, based on what Dr. Mutosho has asked, the purpose for writing this feminist African philosophy, or putting it forward, like it's been with us, but we've not given it the attention that the needed attention. So my purpose is that, like Dr. Oyeleye said, most of the issues that are discussed in feminist philosophy are Western. They do not resonate with us. They do not apply to us as Africans. They do not address our concerns. They do not address our questions. So we need to bring those issues out that are peculiar to us as African women, because of our peculiar experiences, because of our history, because of our historical trajectories, because of what we have experienced and what we are currently facing. So it is important for us to bring out those issues. And I have realized that African philosophy does not address most of those issues for us, because, like I pointed out in the book, most of the branches of African philosophy that we have, African epistemology, African metaphysics, African metaphysics, African political philosophy, they do not address issues that concern women. So it is still, I consider it very important to look at those issues from our own standpoint as African women. And this has this has motivated me to write a book that addresses all these, many of these concerns or many of these issues.
Thank you for that. Do we have any other questions from panelists? Yes, okay.
Thank you, Ma. I would like to ask Dr. Ipadeola why, in her exposition of, the misogynistic nature of African philosophy and her exposition of the source materials of this, African philosophical ideas, meaning the cultural practices, the proverbial sayings and all that, she tends to cite the sayings and practices that only vilify or degrade women. For me, I would think that it would also be nice to include those that do the opposite, because that would enable her to be able to recognize that these practices and sayings, even though they are presented as natural facts, can be utilized in form of what we call symbolic violence, a way of, ensuring that the power struggle between men and women continue, to result in a place where masculinity remains the dominant gender. And in that sense, by acknowledging that these sayings, these practices might not be natural facts, she would be able to, perform maybe a more hermeneutical interrogation of these sayings, or these source materials. I'm just saying. So maybe she can speak to that.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Koliwo. Actually, the sayings that I alluded to in the book, I mentioned in the book, and this is what I believe, that it is not every saying that contributes to the marginalization. It is not everything, but my emphasis is on those sayings that do this, those sayings that contribute to women's marginalization. So, and I think this is not coming from me now. This is coming from Dr. Yeleye. I alluded to Dr. Yeleye's feminist post-proverbials as a way out, as a way of addressing this challenge, that there are indeed some sayings. And like I said, the forum that Prof mentioned earlier on, we talked about this, that proverbs are contextual, they are dynamic, they are not always literal, they don't subscribe to their literal meaning. But it is not everybody that knows this, that when a saying, for example, suggests that women are inferior or women are evil, it is not everybody that is going to understand what it means to go back and look at the basis or the context within which that saying was formulated. It's not everyone that has that is able to do that, but it's going to affect the way such people, whether they know the context, the story behind it, or the reason behind that, behind the formulation of that saying or that proverb, it's going to affect the way they view women, the way they behave to women, the way they treat women. So that is why it is important for us to re-examine those sayings. And Dr. Yeleye has suggested that through feminist post-proverbials, we could look at those proverbs again and look at what they do in contributing to women's marginalization and reformulate them to rid them of that. So I don't know. Yes, I think I don't know. Have I answered your question, Dr. Akoliwo?
Somewhat. Sharon has something to say. So please go on, Sharon.
Yes, Prof. I don't know how much time we have, so I will just
no, we still have a few minutes.
Okay.
Yes, we have 8 minutes.
Okay, great. I wanted to say that seriously, to put a 238-page thing together is not a joke. You've done quite well. I mean, it's commendable. And another reason why I will commend you is because you've given us something to put on the table. I mean, we all talk about this decolonization, and everybody is like, so what is this decolonization? How do we decolonize? You have just shown us one way of decolonizing, which I totally subscribe to, which is name this problem or name this issue, and then name the solution or show us the solution. So for me, I am looking at, and the reason why I'm doing that is because I belong to two spaces. One is the space where we do these kinds of philosophizing. The other one is the space where we try to re-examine and to bring these things into practice, teaching them in a women's studies curriculum or in a gender studies curriculum, talking about how feminist is it or how unfeminist, as the case may be, is, and so on and so forth. So I'm aware of the conversations that are going on in spaces outside philosophy. And that is why I will not subscribe to you restricting feminist African philosophy as a branch of African philosophy. No, I will rather say that you leave it as a method. Let us have it, give it to us as a methodological framework. So when I write in African epistemology, for example, I am using feminist African philosophical tool to discuss African epistemology. That is why we need to rework this book. And so I'm suggesting to you that come to Women's Research and Documentation Center. At WADOC, we have a seminar where we put these things on the table. Bring Yinka, Okwe, everybody. Let's give you our own sniff, our idea of what you have written. Oh, this is what I think of you. This is what I think. This is how I'm looking at it. And then we all put this together and it becomes the book back. Because we need this book, and it's an urgent task that we are giving to you to give us something, you know, from this space and even across the continent that we can adopt also, you know, within the context of African philosophy, and definitely feminist philosophy within the African space. Thank you. Thank you so much for this.
Okay.
I don't want you to feel bad about this. This
No,
is what the philosophy
no, sorry, please.
but really.
I see hands up. But Stacy, you haven't said anything more. Would you like to, before the other people who have said things, say we have 5 minutes. So can Stacy, do you want to respond to something here? Maybe one minute all round.
I will only respond. I can't elaborate because you've already condensed the question so well. All of my previous comments into the question of scale, the unit of analysis.
Yes.
So instead of using my time to say more, I'll just bounce that back forward. The unit of analysis.
Yes, that is important, and you didn't address it. How can we use Africa as a unit of analysis? And why that question is especially potent in gender discourses is when people cite practices that are oppressive and we want to put an end to it. But if you cite a particular oppressive practice that is in village A, but doesn't exist in village B, how do we take care of it when you overgeneralize like that? How can Africa remain a unit of analysis? I think it's an important question that you should pay, to which you must pay attention. Then I'm glad, I think it was Okwe who drew our attention to the fact that you did not mention Sophie Oluwole, and I cannot let us go forward without emphasizing that that is such a huge omission. I cannot even begin to tell you, because Sophie Oluwole, and she got her PhD at the University of Ibadan too, was the first Nigerian PhD in philosophy. The first Nigerian woman with a PhD in philosophy. So in this kind of work, she needs to be there, front, back and center. So I please take that too into account. I think the terms of discourse are very important. We're not even agreed on what is African feminism, you know. People like Oyewumi does not claim to be a feminist, you know. So taking so many of these things for granted and just putting it there, those terms have to be discussed and analyzed before you can just put it on the table. There are so many assumptions around these things that are just basic assumptions. And I think those things are important to be addressed. And then the whole concept of traditional African society, what is that? Does it exist? Because that harks back to the whole question of using Africa as a unit of analysis. Africa cannot exist as a unit of analysis. And so there are all sorts of implications around that. Let me stop there, and we have 2 minutes. Should this, I think it should go to Ipadeola, who has written a book, and Abosede, you should have the last word.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you, everyone. Yes, Africa as a unit of analysis. I'm sorry if your reading of my work, if you read my work as trying to homogenize Africa, trying to look at Africa as one unit, I actually pointed out different beliefs. That, for example, when I mentioned the issue of virginity, I cited another example of a community where it is even important, where they consider it's important for a woman to have children before getting married. So there are different issues, and I think I raised those issues. However, that does not still negate the fact that there are issues that need to be addressed. And that is where my emphasis is. And on Dr. Omotosho's position that it has to be a method and not a branch, I do not subscribe to that. I do not agree. This is because when you read Locke, for example, when you read, maybe it's old-fashioned. When you read Locke as a political philosopher, he did his work under philosophy. It does not mean that his work is not relevant in other contexts or to other disciplines. And this is the way I want us to view feminist African philosophy. It is domiciled in philosophy, in African philosophy. I am happy about that. That is where my area is, and that is where I am. Even if we view contemporary realities as being against, I don't really focus. I'm a trained philosopher, but I don't do everything within philosophy alone. I go to see what is happening in other places, but philosophy is my home. And that is the way I view scholarship. So the philosophy is my intellectual home. And that is the way I've also written feminist African philosophy. It is domiciled in African philosophy, but that does not mean that it is not relevant to scholars from other disciplines. So it is not a method, it is a branch. And I still remain on that position. That it is
okay, thank you so much. Philosophy. Thank you so much, Abosede Ipadeola. And thank you all to the panelists, Olayinka Oyeleye, Stacy Vanderhurst,
thank you.
Sharon Omotosho, and Okpe. Thank you so much. This is the end of our panel.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm grateful. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Like someone said, maybe I can't be offended. I'm a philosopher. Okay. Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll be talking about this.
Yes, we'll definitely continue the discussion.
If you don't criticize my ideas, I don't like it. So when you criticize my ideas, I'm grateful and I'm happy. I'm a philosopher, so I can never be offended. That is one